So it's 1:00 and welcome to this panel. My name is Judith Tucker and I'm really honoured to be chairing this session, Art Making, Process and Identity, which chimes with so many issues which I myself have grappled with, and I'm very, very much looking forward to hearing and responding to the papers. Griselda Pollock begins her book, After Effects, After Images, Trauma and Aesthetic Transformation in the Virtual Feminist Museum, with the following questions. She asks, do artists affected by or obligated to haunting pasts journey away from or towards an encounter with traumatic residues? Later, she said, a second question arises. Can aesthetic practices, the creation of after images, bring about transformation? She writes, this does not imply cure or resolution of the traces, the after effects of trauma, personal or historical, inhabiting the world that artists also process as participants in and sense for our life worlds and our troubled histories. Finally, what modes of reading aesthetic practices might be mobilised to answer such questions? The reason that I'm bringing those questions in at the beginning of this session is I feel it takes us away from some of the issues which might have seemed a little bit divisive in earlier sessions, where we're asking whose histories are these, who is, the daughter of a survivor, who is a daughter of a refugee, what is the difference between a migrant and a refugee, and so on. And I feel these questions take this as the after effects of a traumatic event is what's key here. Now, the three papers presented here by such distinguished practitioners will address these issues from the practitioner's perspective through the very processes of making, whether they print, draw, make installation or deal with lens-based work. And what is even more important is the subsequent encounters with these works in a gallery for any viewer. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Judy Goldhill and Ballard, who are giving a joint presentation in Reparation, Psychoanalysis and Second Generation Visual Arts. There are extended biographies available for you to read, but just to mention that Judy Goldhill, having studied at St Martin's, then worked as a picture editor on the British Journal of Photography and co-editor of Creative Camera, and has extremely impressive list of exhibitions. And she particularly wanted me to mention that she's had 4 artist residencies in astronomy and physics in North and South America and University College London. And in a way, she also mentions that it was these conflated with her searching for her father with and the physical fragments that she has to piece them together. And I find that really fascinating. And Ballard read History of Art at the University of Sussex and then has worked in the Royal Academy in Tate, and also did an MA at St Martin's. And what she has asked me to draw attention to is that she's been interested in a psychoanalytic understanding of creativity for more than 20 years, and it continues to inform her practice. She completed a psychoanalysis herself recently, and among many other things, explored her creativity. So over to you two. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your introduction, Judith. So this paper looks at psychoanalytical ideas on creativity, taking 2 second-generation artists, Judy Goldhill and Ballard. Their collaboration began as a conversation about shared experience of generational trauma and early parental loss, encompassing recovered objects, photographs and letters. It's led to the exhibitions Breeze at the Freud Museum in 2018 and Travelling Companions still at Cambridge University, which is hopefully reopening at the end of this year. And Faye is not Jewish. Judy's parents escaped Nazi Germany in 1937-38 and settled in England as refugees. Her mother fled Nuremberg in 1937 via Czechoslovakia, aged 10, and her father, aged 18, from Hamburg. Her mother, who's still alive, was traumatized by the disruption of her comfortable life, which built a barrier of emotions she finds too painful to discuss, a wall of silence too agonizing for Judy to break. Judy's father, Harold, served in the British Army, trained as an architect, and died of polio after spending 3 months encased in an iron lung when Judy was a baby. She grew up without him, a void in her life. Understanding him has been a drip feed of memory from her mother. They were married for 5 years before he died.
Born in Shanghai in 1930, Faye's father experienced the trauma of war and imprisonment in a Japanese internment camp before moving to England after the war. As a boy, he witnessed the Chinese dying from starvation on Shanghai streets and their torture and death by invading Japanese soldiers in 1937. He and his family entered Louwagie internment camp in 1943 until 1945. His father testified in the war crimes trials in Hong Kong. Ballard later reflected, "When I came to England, I think I was carrying a huge cargo of death, and I couldn't understand why all this had happened. Why did human beings behave in such a bestial way towards each other?" In his book, The Body Keeps the Score, Mind, Brain and the Body in the Transformation of Trauma, Petzal van der Kolk, founder and medical director of the Trauma Center, Boston, writes that trauma overwhelms its victims and can create a zone of silence. In 1964, Faye's mother died suddenly on holiday in Spain and was buried in Alicante. The silence around her mother's death grew until she was no longer mentioned in the family. Faye's grandmother was never able to talk about her experience of Japanese imprisonment. Both artists lived under the shadow of their family's wartime experiences, retold through anecdotal stories, and they also experienced the trauma of a parent's death. Speaking in 2008, Faye's father said, "My wife's death was a reminder that you couldn't pretend death had left the stage. Death was present in the world. It was liable to make an entrance onto the stage in the midst of life, in a very unexpected moment. Life is a stage set to be dismantled at any time." In her book, Understanding Trauma, a Psychoanalytic Approach, Caroline Garland, founder of the Unit for the Study of Trauma and its Aftermath at the Tavistock Clinic, describes trauma as a kind of wound, the piercing of the skin, a breaking of the bodily envelope. The mind is pierced and wounded by events, and some events will overwhelm the capacity of the individual to knock out ordinary functioning and throw the individual into extreme disarray. It extends far beyond the visible into the depths of the individual's identity. A traumatic event can break through or override the filtering process and overrides any temporary denial or patch up of the damage. The mind is flooded with a kind and degree of stimulation that is far more than it can make sense of or manage. Something very violent feels as though it has happened internally. This mirrors the violence that is felt to have happened, or indeed has actually happened, in the external world. There is a massive disruption in functioning, amounting to a kind of breakdown. It's a breakdown of an established way of going about one's life, of established beliefs about the predictability of the world, of established mental structures, of an established internal defensive organisation. Trust in the world is shattered. Given his experience of war and personal tragedy, Ballard's answer was to tell stories that made sense in an attempt to make 2 and 2 equal 5. Faye's answer to the trauma and silence around her mother was to make drawings to reinstate her.
Judy answered the trauma of her father's death and absence by attempting to reconnect through objects that made the invisible visible. She reimagined his last months by imaging an iron lung and trying to connect with him through the physicality of touch. Despite the silence of her mother's inability to remember, Judy tracked down some of her father's documents in the National Archive at Kew. Here he emerged from the German Heinz Ellen to Harold Ellery. This was a profound experience, an awakening from the vast shelves of the archive to find documents of his naturalisation, letters of recommendation from the Architectural Association and from the architectural company he never lived to work for. When preparing work for the Freud Museum exhibition, Breathe, Judy asked her mother about her father's activities in the war, of which she had no recall, explaining they were a forward-looking couple interested in the present and not the past. However, she did produce a tightly bound file of correspondence containing every letter her father had written to his father, Karl, who had emerged to Palestine and settled in Tel Aviv. Untouched, this gift from the past gave Judy insight into her father through his weekly aerograms, describing his postings in Belgium, Holland, London, Cairo and Alexandria. Conversational and then written in black cursive script. A glimpse into his short life, his longing for a good Jewish marriage, Sabbath gatherings, the boredom and horror of war, and eventual liberation of Bergen-Belsen. The letters express his love of photography and his Leica, the camera that Judy would learn her craft on.
Van der Kolk notes that the arts have the capacity to circumvent the speechlessness that comes with the terror of trauma, and are used as treatments around the world. The object of writing, he says, is to write to yourself, to let yourself know what you have been trying to avoid. In attempting to understand Faye and Judy's impulse to create art, this paper explores psychoanalyst Hannah Siegel's writings on creativity. Siegel was born in Poland in 1918, fled to London from Nazi-occupied Paris, and qualified in psychoanalysis in 1945, having received an analysis with Melanie Klein. In Dream, Fantasy and Art, Siegel links the need for reparation with the creative impulse. The creative act as a form of reparation relates to Judy, Faye and J.G. Ballard, who have sought the need to transform their lived experience into art. Siegel quotes Cézanne. His aim was not to paint attractive pictures, but to work out his salvation. The artist needs to recreate what they feel in the depths of their internal world. They perceive their internal worlds to be broken, leading to the necessity to recreate something that is felt to be a whole new world, but which has traces of a world one has known. The dead and lost loved are present in Judy and Faye's work and in the novels of Faye's father.
Judy has been artist in residence in astronomical observatories in North and South America, photographing the skies and the machines that image the past and show light from the past, perhaps attempting to find her father. In the current issue of Shofar, an interdisciplinary journal of Jewish studies published by Purdue University, the current topic is What's Jewish About Death? In the introduction to the issue, Laura Limonik and Tachnia Oxman discussed Judy's contribution. Quote, Goldhill offers snapshots from her deceased father's life and death, revealing the ways that childhood bereavement carries sharply into and throughout adulthood. Her pairings of warm, light objects and heavy, cold metallic technologies expose how mourning and sadness concurrently offer up the potentiality of looking, refiguring an individual's sense of scale, distance and time.
Loss and regain are felt in Faye's drawings of her mother as she tries to find her from discovered photographs after decades of silence and absence. In Empire of the Sun, The Kindness of Women and Miracles of Life, Ballard reimagines his lost past and recreates a lost world, his wartime childhood in Shanghai, his wife and young family, before finally reassessing his life. He confronts the reality of his loss, as do Faye and Judy. Before 1984, Ballard was unable to write directly about his traumas. Instead, he revisited his shuttered internal world indirectly by creating a vocabulary of imagery Faye recognises as fragments of wartime Shanghai in the camp. Watchtowers, perimeter fences, imprisonment, low-flying aircraft, abandoned empty swimming pools and atom bombs. His dystopian stories speak of imprisonment, violence, death, overload, insanity, mental breakdown, and assassinations. In High Rise, the Japanese internment camp of 2,000 inmates with its own school, theatre and vegetable patch is reimagined into a story about a London tower block of 2,000 tenants complete with school and garden. Faye's father's death in 2009 released her from the spell of family silence surrounding her mother. Her pre-2009 drawings contained an uncanny charge that Freud described as the unheimlich in the homely. Siegel links the creative impulse to the depressive position of the infant, who develops from a paranoid schizoid position. This earlier stage is one of omnipotence and unintegrated feelings of love and hate towards the mother. When the baby reaches a stage of realization that it is separate from mother, it feels guilt at attacking her and seeks to repair by integrating its feelings and showing love for the mother. This is called the depressive position. Like the baby, the artist has the capacity to face and deal with pain, ugliness, and death, to face reality. In the exhibition Breathe at the Freud Museum, curated by psychoanalyst Caroline Garland, Faye and Judy explored parental loss and mourning and the role of art as reparation. Faye searched for her lost mother after clearing the family home after her father's death. She reinstated her mother by drawing her from discovered photographs and by recalling memories of important personal belongings. In 2015, after 51 years, Faye revisited Alicante and drew the ground of her mother's grave.
Whilst hers was a forensic search, Judy's focused on the skies, photographing observatories and stars in the eternal search for her father. Imbued into her very being is his love of photography, which she pursued from the age of 10. He developed films and prints in the home bathroom and made annotated photo albums from contact sheets. One album documents his journey with her mother from Rome to Israel, attempting to persuade her to settle in Israel, which she declined, not wanting to be uprooted again or parted from her family home, now settled in Wembley Park, London.
If creativity is the resolution of a depressive state, Siegel believes the aesthetic experience shared with the audience is achieved when both ugly and beautiful elements come together. She quotes Rodin, "What we call ugly in reality, in art can become great beauty. We call ugly that which suggests illness, suffering, destruction. We also call ugly the immoral, the vicious, the criminal, and all abnormality which brings evil. Let an artist get hold of this ugliness. Immediately they transfigure it into beauty." Siegel cites Picasso's Guernica, where the ugliness of the breaking up of body parts and animals torn apart by the devastation of the Spanish Civil War is transformed into an object of beauty. This is achieved by a process of integration, and she quotes Paul Klee. To achieve vital harmony, the picture must be constructed of parts themselves incomplete, brought together in harmony at the last stroke. In J.G. Ballard's work, such as Empire of the Sun, war's violence and horror are transformed into a work of profound humanity. Judy and Faye attempt to transform pain into beauty. Siegel believed reparation must include an acknowledgement of aggression and its effect. The baby realizes its aggression towards the mother and seeks reparation. In art, the stone has to be cut, the clay punnelled, the blank canvas painted, the white paper marked. Once the first pencil mark has been drawn, something flawless has been infringed, and it has to be made good. Furthermore, the artist not so much creates, but reveals a reality. Part of the aesthetic experience has to do with a feeling of revelation of a truth which is discovered, not invented. Siegel writes, achieving something in the external world is essential to the artist's feeling of completed reparation. The artist returns to external reality by doing something in and for the real external world. So if my assumption is correct, that the artist in their work is again working through their infantile depressive position, then they too have not only to recreate something in their inner world, they also have to externalize and give it life in the external world.
In the Travelling Companions exhibition in Cambridge University, personal belongings and the skies are explored as companions to life. Skies and stars become companions of navigation and journeys.
Faye's father played chess with American merchant seamen in the internment camp, then with her teenage brother. This travelling companion evokes memories and thoughts. In her book, Evocative Objects, Sherry Turkle, psychologist at MIT, says, we find it familiar to consider objects as either useful or aesthetic, as necessities or vain indulgences. We are on less familiar ground when we consider objects as companions to our emotional lives or as provocations to thought. Turtle makes the case for the object as a companion in life's experience. Daniel Miller, anthropologist at UCL, suggests objects represent and create us in his book Stuff. Our houses with our stuff are our autobiographies. In homes, people create themselves through stuff. We are able to see ourselves in this extension of ourselves. We can come to understand who we are. Miller believes moving house becomes a means to reshuffle relationships and memories by bringing them back into consciousness, by making them explicit, and for deciding which ones to reinforce, which ones to abandon or put on hold. The paring down of objects transforms the memory from a more actual to a more idealized one. The importance of an object as an emotional companion can be traced to the toddler's transitional object, as defined by paediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott in his essay, Transitional Objects, Transitional Phenomena, a Study of the First Not Me Possession. The infant shifts from a state of where it believes mother and baby are one to outer reality and the realization that mother is a separate person by means of a transitional space. This space mediates external reality for the child, as it experiences a me, not me state of mind. In this space, the child chooses an object, such as a teddy bear or a piece of cloth, which becomes part baby, part external mother. The object brings comfort, and the baby develops a strong attachment to it. Looking into Judy's photographs of the skies, Faye sees her father in Shanghai, recalling love for his original home, as if his soul was in one country and his physical presence in another. He was an outsider in England, observing life from a slight angle, and Faye was aware of this growing up.
Judy's father's surname, Ellery, has been resurrected by the birth of Judy's grandson, called Ellery, who was born February 2021, possibly extending the father's short 34-year-old life. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for such a rich and an inspiring start to the session. And then we're going on to another duo for the second part, and we'll be doing questions as we've done in previous sessions at the end about all the papers that we can start to draw together threads. This time it's Lorna Brunstein, the artist, and Katie O'Brien, artist and director of 444 AD Art Space in Bath, who are in an interview situation. Thank you so much. And this presentation is Inherited Trauma, Place, Embodied Memory, and Artistic Practice Conversation. And Lorna Brunstein has creative practice has attended to the impact of what she calls inherited Holocaust trauma and embodied memory, drawing on her own life experience as the child of Holocaust survivors, visiting sites of memory and working with fragments of testimony. And as you'll see, she creates spaces in which to reflect on themes of identity, loss, displacement, home and exile. And the curator, Katie O'Brien, has supported and presented Lorna's work following an earlier encounter with the installation. Lorna studied fine art at Aberystwyth and wasn't able to approach this subject in her creative work for many, many years. But she was offered an opportunity to participate in an exhibition in France, which was exploring ideas around memories of a place I once inhabited. And this was, as far as I can understand, was the stimulus for her following practice. And what she's written to me in an email is, she said, I suppose what I'm saying is the reason I make artwork is precisely because I can't talk about it. For me, it's beyond words. She writes, I find it impossible to articulate in spoken language the overwhelmingness of the experience of the Holocaust and its repercussions. My work is all about feelings and emotions and the trauma and universality of unbearable loss. That's why I work in installation, using a mixture of media and art forms that can communicate on many sensory levels and in many languages: visual, oral, tactile, spoken, and so on. And my aim is to create an immersive space in which to contemplate and reflect. And her interlocutor, Katie O'Brien, is an artist, curator, and the project director of 44 AD Art Space, who studied fine art at Bath School of Art and Design and has set up this community art space, which sounds very exciting. So I believe we're going to now be watching the video, which I'm lucky enough to have already seen. You've got a treat in store.
So you're a second generation Holocaust survivor, and your parents were Polish. Your father had been imprisoned by the Soviet Union, and your mother had been liberated from Belsen as a young girl. I think she was about 15 or so.
16 at the end of the war, yeah.
So they met in England and then had you and their family. So growing up, how much of their experiences and the trauma that they've been through were you aware of, and how did it impact on family life?
They were very damaged people, obviously, because of what happened to them. They loved us very much. The Holocaust was always there in the house. It was just present everywhere. And they were very protective. My father especially so. His sanctuary was his home. Finding, marrying my mum, having me and my sister, getting a house.
I'm just wondering, can you see the image that I
can. So that's the front room. Okay, that's not the front. That's an installation that I've entitled "How Did I Come to Be Here?" And that's a line from some writing of my father's that I found. Only piece of writing he ever did. He didn't speak much about his experiences, and he didn't write much apart from this one piece of writing, but he painted. He was an artist, and his paintings.
These are his paintings in the installation. Yeah.
The house was my father's gallery. It was covered with paintings, and these paintings were depicted pre-war Jewish life in Warsaw, and the horrors of his experiences during prison and leaving his parents, who he never saw again, and it was overwhelming. And I, as a teenager, just wanted to hang out with my friends and go out. But there were catchphrases in our house. He would say, "Oh, you don't really need to go out, do you? Why don't you stay at home and have a cup of tea and sit on the sofa with me? And we'll all, it'll be nice. We can watch television and we can just all be together." And that was really the room, the house was his sanctuary. But for me, it was becoming like my prison.
Was this piece, this installation, was this one of the first times you'd addressed the personal histories of your parents in your artwork?
Actually, this wasn't the first one. No, it wasn't. It's interesting, but it wasn't. It was triggered by me finding that memoir of his. And that was after my father had died, and we were clearing out my mum's flat because she was going into a care home. And I just found this book with his writing. And when I read it, it just made me realise how terrible it must have been for him. And so I'd had loads of resentment for a long time, but somehow reading that and making this artwork is kind of my coming to terms with it, my reconciliation with him, something of that sort. It depicts, it's a whole room, and it depicts his journey from hell, really, to sanctuary, but it's also my journey of needing to leave and get out and find out who I was. So it's a bit of a dialogue between my dad and me. So Soundscape got my voice in it, and his words in it, and so on. It's a multimedia piece.
So your father was from Warsaw in Poland, and where was your mother from?
She was from Lodz, second largest city in Poland. She was much younger than him. There was 13 years difference, and she came from quite a different family to his. He was an only child. She was one of three, and only one brother survived of hers. My dad was the only one of his family to survive.
So did you get to go back to Poland with your parents at all?
The whole family went on a visit to Poland in 1989. So it was me and my mum and my dad, my uncle, the one brother of my mother that survived, and my sister. And we went to Poland, and we were there for a week. It's the first time we'd been. And we went to all the sites of horror, but we also, Auschwitz and the place in Warsaw where they assembled people before they were deported, and so on. Treblinka, the death camp where my father's parents would have been murdered. But we also went to my mum's childhood home in a place called Dobrzyn, and it was actually a small little town where her mother and all the family had grown up on her mother's side.
So this image that I've just brought up from the Dobrzyn room, can you see it?
That's a photograph that I took very surreptitiously because we could only spend a few minutes in this.
Can you talk me through who's in this image here?
Yes, so my uncle is on the right. It's my mother's brother. There's my mum. Just behind her, there's a woman with a hand. She's the person living in this house now. It's a flat, an apartment, and the person standing in the doorway is her daughter. And we found this. My mum just wanted to go back to Dobrzyn and find this place because that was one place she remembered being happy. She and her brothers used to go back when they were young in school holidays to visit and spend time there with their grandmother, and they had very, very happy memories of that place. And in fact, the whole family all lived in Dobrzyn, had done for many, many, many years.
And we should explain that this photograph here is from your installation called the Dobrzyn Room.
It is. Yes.
Would you like to expand on the artwork that you created from this visit?
Well, the very first thing, I just want to say, the very first thing as we walked in, my uncle, who was 4 years older than my mum, so his memories were clearer, we stood there and he looked around and he said to my mum in Yiddish, because the owners of the place wouldn't understand Yiddish. He looked at my mum and he whispered, "I don't believe it, the wallpaper is still the same." And I mean, that was a moment that I won't forget. The room hadn't been decorated in 50 years and it felt as if it hadn't been cleaned. I looked around and he said everything's the same. And I found myself looking at the light switch. It's just behind the arm that's pointing of that lady that's standing behind my mum. I looked at the light switch and there was grease around it. There was marks and there were cobwebs, and I just felt ghosts in the room. I felt my family was there. I felt their fingerprints, the air that we were breathing.
You had touched that light switch, you know, years before.
Absolutely. You know, they would have laughed and joked and ate and worked and done all the things and sung, you know, all the things that we all do, you know, sat down and had a meal in that house, in that flat, in that room. And then I know, because I've researched, and we encountered a man in the Dobshin Market Square, and who my mum got talking to before we found this apartment, and he knew the family. I mean, it was extraordinary. He was 8 when the Nazis came and sort of rounded up all the Jews and told he told the story that they were given 20 minutes to leave, and it was a small little town. About 80% of the population were Jewish, and he said it was, you know, he remembered that moment. So it's extraordinary. My mum met him. He was the last witness to my whole family being rounded up and taken and never came back.
Yeah, the importance of being there and place, which is so, you know, runs strongly through your work.
Yes.
So just going back to this installation, and you mentioned the light switch that you had come across. So that features within the installation. So here we can see the light switch.
Yes, and
paper.
and I reproduced the wallpaper by zooming in, you know, with the wonders of Photoshop, zooming into this one black and white photo, and there was this weird pattern on it, and my uncle had to remind me what colour the wallpaper was, and it was this sort of slightly dirty institutional green, and I found that, and I made a roll of wallpaper. So I used that in the I did the original installation. That was my very first piece of work that I did about the Holocaust. 13 years after this visit, I couldn't do it before then. And that was a simple installation of the room and sound. But I made further work that developed from it quite a few years later. And you'll know that work, Katie, because that was an exhibition, a group exhibition, that group show called Traces that we held in your gallery. And so I made for that, I did more work. I revisited the Dobshin room and I made more work. And that moment of the complete realization that the whole of my family, except for my mother and one brother, had been completely eliminated. And I felt that standing in that room. I was confronted with that. So that was the trigger that got me going, started making work.
So you'd gone to Poland with your family, and then you made this piece years later. I first saw it, I think, in about 2013.
Yeah.
Was your father still alive then? I know your mother was. I've met your mother. What did they think of your artwork? I mean, well,
my father knew that I went to art school, and he was very proud, and you know, he said, "You've got my genes," and all of that. But he doesn't know that done any of this work. My mum did. My dad died in 1994, but my mum was proud and pleased. She came to that exhibition at the Dobshin Room.
And the Forced Walks project was really interesting because I came along for the Somerset side of the walk.
That was retracing the death march that my mum was forced to make. We walked it in Somerset, we transposed the route in Somerset, but we also walked it in the original route in Germany. It was a collaboration I did with my partner. My mum knew she was getting elderly then, but she knew about that, and she was very, very involved in, helped me with the research. And
you had the project running with 44 AD, and you exhibited there, and a lot of us came and did the walk with you. So it was becoming quite participatory. People were interacting with, the project.
Yes.
How did you find that started kind of seeping in and working with your work, where other people were beginning to participate with it, rather than it just being your own sort of outpouring of what your parents had experienced?
Yeah, that's been a development. Forced Walks was the first one, and that was, as I say, a collaboration with my partner, and he's a walking artist, and he works in a very performative, participatory way. And what I did for that, the German leg of that walk, I collected soil from every stopping place. There were 10 stopping points on the route of the walk, and it was just, I felt I needed to take something back with me, something that held memory.
Your work is all about memory. I mean, obviously taking in the other themes, it's about you and your parents' memory, real and imagined. And you talk about embodied memory. So how do you work with that, and how is it manifested in your practice?
Well, in Forced Walks, I felt I needed to bring something back with me that held that experience, that moment, that the death march, and all I could think that I could bring back was soil. And soil is like a witness. It's like trees. It's just there. It sees, it knows what's happening. It is a living thing. It gives life. Plants grow in it, and it takes life. We bury our dead in it. It's matter. And the steps we walked along this death march were walked by my mother so many years. In 1945 she walked that walk, and we were doing it in 2016. And so her and the others that walked with her, many of whom died, would have trodden on that same ground. And so there's remains there. And we ended up in Belsen, and the last soil sample was at the entrance to Belsen. And so I feel that the soil that I brought back holds that memory. And I'm kind of developing it further in my most recent work after Auschwitz, which is my recollections of coming back from Auschwitz, which is where my mum was and my grandmother was. I went to Auschwitz. I've been to Auschwitz I'd been to Auschwitz before with my mum, but in the year of her death, since 2017, she died beginning of 2017, and at the end of that year, there was an opportunity for me to go back to Auschwitz again, but as me in my own right, really. I didn't go intending to make a piece of work at all. I went as a personal, for personal family reasons, to remember my mum who had been there, and to kind of honour my grandmother who I never knew. And we went with this group, the UAF, Unite Against Fascism. So they were all activists.
And we should probably mention that your mother, I mean, she'd been very active throughout her later years, talking about her experiences of the Holocaust.
Yes.
So
she became quite a public speaker, and in fact spoke on anti-Nazi League platforms, and a lot of the Unite Against Fascism group, old timers, remembered her. For me, the powerful moment was standing on the selection point at Auschwitz, where my mother stood and my grandmother, and my mum was 16 and she was sent one way, and that was for slave labour, and my grandmother was sent the other way, and that was death. That was the gas chambers, and my grandmother was 44. And that my mother could never talk about that moment. And for me to stand there with my daughter 73 years later on that same spot was hugely powerful and really important, and in a bizarre way kind of quite life affirming, because we could go back. My mother and grandmother, they had no choice. They were, but we exercised that choice to sort of, and we're their legacy, we're here. And so the artwork, which only kind of came to me really while I was there, I was continuing with the theme of soil and embodiment. I asked all the members of the group who came with me if I could have the soil from the sole of their shoes, and I made an installation piece of work with that soil.
And that was after Auschwitz.
That's after Auschwitz, and that was exhibited in the East End of London, where my parents both met as refugees and where I first lived before we.
And I've seen this installation, and it's interesting here because you start moving again into more performative work, and there's a film of you where you're immersing yourself in the soil. So I don't know if you want to talk about that. And also it's interesting because this piece or this installation was exhibited in Whitechapel, which again is going back to your roots and where you grew up. So it might be nice to talk a bit about that.
Yes, well, as I said, my parents met as refugees after the war in the East End, and lived in one room above a shop on the Whitechapel High Street. It's within, striking distance of where this gallery was. So it felt like the right place to show this work. And yes, I used the soil in a much more visceral, kind of intimate, close way, performative way, as it's the closest I can get to my grandmother, and that soil will somehow it contains her remains.
Reconnecting you in a, you've taken it from that place, and yeah.
So the video shows that, so we can watch that now.
Well, it's been fantastic to talk to you, Lorna. Thank you for sharing your art and your experiences with me and everyone who's watching this.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us, and I'm sure that people will be able to understand a lot of links between papers we saw earlier in terms of the motifs that have been selected, but also some very interesting use of the soil. And I was going to sort of flag up a question that I might ask later, which is very naughty, but I'm taking chair's privilege to do that, which is how you're working both with and against the idea of blood and soil here. But for our final presentation, delighted to welcome Monica Petzal to give her presentation called Memory, Time and Printmaking here. And brilliant. We've got it. I can see that works. That's super, Monica. Thank you. And she's got a very impressive biography, and I will just make one or two edited remarks about it, and you can read the rest in the biography part of the conference. But she did history of art at Sussex, and then went to the RCA, and has co-founded the Foundation for Women's Art, which is an important charity aimed at increasing public knowledge and understanding of women artists through exhibitions. And then later she went to Camberwell to do a 2A MA in printmaking, and has subsequently shown her work widely in both museum shows and in private galleries. And she also is a curator. And has co-curated Process and Innovation, British Printmaking Japan at the Kyoto Museum. And she runs a gallery, print room, and to develop the themes that have been running through this last two presentations, she's had a long-standing interest in family stories, not just her own, but she's also done life story interviews for the British Library, including with Annalee Judah, Norbert Linton, John Casman and Leslie Waddington. But recently she's been focusing on her own family. And I think no doubt we'll be hearing more about that in this presentation. So thank you very much. I look forward to this.
Well, I'd first of all like to thank Imogen and Fransiska and the other Monica for all the ongoing support they gave me during the making and the showing of Descent and Displacement. This year, because of the pandemic, we have understood more clearly how time affects what we do and how and who we are in the world. I'm interested in why at this relatively late stage in my career, I started reconsidering and reassembling my family and other histories. I also wanted to reflect on how my process of printmaking is so different from that of writing, the relationship between time and process. I'm not alone in my interest in family. There's a positive explosion of interest in genealogy and second generation issues, in migration and memory, as in the title of this symposium. Media gives us plenty of fodder, from Who Do You Think You Are and DNA Family Secrets on TV, to the newscasts of George Alagaya writing on migration, memory and me in a recent issue of the Financial Times. With time on one's hands and internet access, a whole world is waiting to be discovered. And inevitably the contents of the attic, both real and imagined. I'm culpable on all counts, an online searcher, a keeper of objects, and a great pursuer of memories. In his fascinating new book, The House of Fragile Things, James Macaulay writes eloquently on collecting. To collect is to create. Collectors do not so much arrange or even possess objects as transform them. In a collection, each object becomes an artifact, something entirely different from what it was before, and an object's meaning changes when it finds a new home and a new place among other objects and in the possession of a person who desires it. Its values shift, and so does its context. What collectors create are themselves. Susan Stewart, in her book on longing, suggests collecting is the deliberate, personal withdrawal into a nostalgic past. The collection, she wrote, seeks a form of self-enclosure. I am second generation, the third child of German Jewish parents who fled Nazi persecution. I have over many years assembled fragments relating to my family, which exist in many forms, boxes of archives and books, photographs and documents. To the left, my maternal grandfather, Erich Zakowitz, in his German soldier's uniform of World War I, with his wife Sophie Berlowitz and my mother, aged about 18 months. Centre top, my uncle Werner Petzal's passport of 1924. Below, a Petzal family album showing my late grandparents and possibly a great-grandmother. And on the right, one of my mother's school reports from 1932. Then there are the objects, the door plates from my grandfather's dental surgery in Dresden and London, the Petzal family silver with embossed initials, and the drawing of my mother by Konrad Felixmüller, part of a larger collection by the artist who was a close friend of my Dresden grandparents. Not shown is the Rosenthal china, the Bauhaus furniture, the books on the Nuremberg trials, and much more. And then there are the collections resulting from trips and projects. The testament certificate for my cousin Elizabeth, killed in Auschwitz, aged 16 months, from Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Remembrance Centre in Jerusalem. The blue lupins in my garden, grown from seed taken from the Westerbork internment camp in Holland. A set of old prints about my father's house in Berlin, made after visiting with him on a restitution visit. A photograph of the restored Frauenkirche in Dresden, reflecting time spent in the city working at the Graphic Werkstatt, and my work as the Vice Chair of the Dresden Trust, working on reconciliation. And conversations and books. The latter's too numerous to list, but crucial is my talking to my family, to other artists and writers, the Syrian refugee doctor who is part of this project, the printing paper company, Kieran, who mends my press, all have something to contribute. In 2013, I started processing some of the material, creating the Dresden project, Indelible Marks, which was shown in Dresden for the 70th anniversary of the bombing, and then at the Herbert Museum in Coventry. I was then commissioned to make an exhibition, Descent to Displacement, for the New Walk Museum in Leicester. This was to cover some of the same territory, but also to explore more widely some of the issues in the title. It is one thing to have collections. It is another to curate and transform them into something meaningful. I am helped by having the space, which I'm in at this moment, a large studio with a temperamental 40-year-old Polish offset lithographic press and an equally bad-tempered transformer to maintain the wavering electricity supply on our farm in Suffolk. The technicalities are important because they constantly interfere with the processes, and delay and disappointment often gives rise to reconsideration and change. Every part of my long making process intertwines the thinking and the making, and each one interrupts the other in an ultimately meaningful way. For the exhibition, I created a narrative and a layout plan, 6 sets of prints, each with 6 prints. There are 36 bulging labelled plastic folders of images and notes, and I worked sequentially. To create each print, I surround myself with the contents of one of the envelopes and slow down. I am interested in access, engagement, and understanding. I do not want to be insular or obscure in my search for meaning. I want what I make to be accessible to everyone who chooses to come into a public space to view my work. This may be stereotyping, but I think of my viewer as a 14-year-old boy. I think about my son at that age. I need to get this young person's attention and interest. The images together with the text need to reach out. They need to tell a compelling story. They can tell problematic stories, but they must not repel. They must engage not only through their content, but formally through size, colour and strength of imagery. Size is crucial to this large museum space, and the prints are to be 100 centimetres high by 70 centimetres wide. This will be technically difficult to print, but at this stage I do not know quite how tricky. Each black and white image is created by scanning up to 20 separate images and using Photoshop to create a composite collaged image. I did at one stage call this talk Photoshop as metaphor. It's sued, but it does have some truth to it. Photoshop, like our memories, allows layering, transparency, superimposition, fading, and has hundreds of other effects. My aim is a balance, to retain something of the rough collage feel and not to employ too many tricks. The process of selecting what goes into each image is slow. It's about telling the story, including both the personal and the more widely recognisable. It shifts interminably between the ideas and the formal image-making qualities. As I move images around on the screen, I'm trying to find a resolution as to what I want to say and how to say it. I am careful to save files, but on the occasions I forget, it is prophetic, and I start again and find a different way forward. There is an element of chance as to what ends up going on the image. Unlike a book which you can revise and revise, once you decide what's going on the image, it's final. Each completed flattened file is sent off to a specialist firm in London who use very high resolution film to create a full size 100 by 70 centimetre transparency. Film allows for a very high layer of pixelation, a level of fine detail which cannot be done digitally. When the transparencies come back, I start to make the colour underprinting, which is a monoprint, which means it's just printed once. This means I take a blank metal plate and put it on the press, and a clean sheet of paper in the printing area. I print the transparency I'm going to work on the wall in front of me and the press for reference and think about colour, texture and mark. For each transparency I make 8 monoprints because I know that neither all the monoprints or the top black prints are going to work out. The monoprinting is deeply enjoyable once I've started to think about the colour plans for a set of 6 prints. I keep a set of colour notes about each set of prints. I mix up all the inks which I keep. I start to have a complex visual relationship to the black and white images I have created. Using lithographic, oil-based inks, rollers, brushes, and everything else to hand, I work like on a painting on the blank plate and then run the press. The rubber roller of the press moves to the far end of the press, then across the plate, and then deposits the ink on the paper. Each monoprint goes through the press many times as I build up thin layers of colour. It must not be too dense or the top layer will not be visible. The monoprints usually take a day each and up to a week to dry. The mess is often awful, as the more I get caught up in the process, the more the ink goes everywhere. All over the slab as the inking up table is known, and inevitably on me. Cleaning up the press, plate, slab and the rollers always takes an hour and is usually accompanied by loud music to keep me cheerful and on task. It is also a time when I can think about the next day and the next monoprint. Monoprint's done, I need to print the top image. First, I process the plates, which mean I put the transparency onto my large developer in the darkroom and expose it with a pre-tested precise amount of light onto a sensitized lithographic plate. I then pick it up and move quickly to a very large sink where I have the chemicals measured out and waiting in a plastic jug ready to develop it. Careful to put gloves on first, I flood and then swab the plate with special pads and watch as miraculously the image appears. That's the image from the transparency. I dry it with a hairdryer and protect it with a thin layer of gum. Printing the transparent image proves a problem. Not because I do not know how to do it, but because I do not have the physical reach. I have had a special roller made for the inking up, 72 centimetres wide, just wider than the plate. However, the plate is 100 centimetres high and I cannot stretch that far. If you stop the roller anywhere other than the either end, a black line is left. I tried for a couple of months to make this work. I waste a vast amount of monoprints and then asked for my help from my good friend and master printer, Simon Burbage from Camberwell School of Art. Simon steps up to the job with his 6'2" frame and very long arms. We work as a team. I keep the plate damp while Simon rolls up. I dry it, that's the hairdryer again, and run the press. We do spectacularly long days, many of them starting at 7 a.m, coping with the temperamental press and praying that the transformer will not blow, which it has already done twice. Who knows if both our levels of anxiety and stress are conveyed into the work. Simon and I print over 300 pieces of work, including test runs of black and white. From the finished prints, 34 will be chosen for the exhibition. The last 2 are digital. We lay prints out in groups on the floor, searching for the best ones to use. Once selected, I precisely tear down the paper edges to leave a uniform deckled edge and then hand colour the edges to match the underprinting. I hang the unframed work in the studio to look at it and to meet up with Julia Neuberger, who is writing the foreword to the catalogue / book which goes with the exhibition. They are then mounted on archival foam board and are ready to go to the framer to be archivally mounted and framed with museum glass. The museum at Leicester, by the time I get there, has no curator, and so the exhibition was entirely put together by me and the designer Simon Watkins. I placed everything, including the objects, in cabinets and allowed the technical team to install, supervising down to the last text panel. Even at this late stage, there are choices to be made about what goes where, how you read and understand the exhibition. It opened in early February 2020 and closed with lockdown. Descent and Displacement is about narrative and testament, identity and memory. It is about how we construct and interpret history and attach meaning. I believe that retelling our stories and making them accessible helps us to understand who we are and offers a space in which to consider how to move forward. Thank you.